Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tyler, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
It's the end of the book, and we know it, and I feel fine. I kind of goofed that up. Should we
I'm
take
okay
it
with
again?
it. No,
Let's
we
take
do
it
not.
again. We're not going to edit it out, but let's take it again. It's the end of the book as we know it, and I feel fine. Good evening, or whenever you're listening to us. This is a train wreck already. Welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast. Although not this week, as is our tradition, we are not reading something new this week, but we are spending one last week celebrating the end of, in this case, book number 5, and I always have to check.
Yes, you do.
The Fires of Heaven, or yes, this
Yep.
one still has the article. And we always like to close out, this long journey. I was actually just joking on my social media about how it was a long journey this time, over 6 months. Please don't speak. I have not introduced you. So it's very exciting to get to celebrate that and being done and preparing ourselves to continue the journey into the second third of this series, which is unbelievable. I, of course, am Greg, your host with personality and no knowledge, joined, of course, by the host with knowledge and just a smattering of personality. It's Tyler. Tyler, how are you?
I'm doing very well. I believe my personality is making himself known right now. Apologies if you can hear my dog, Samson. Honestly, anytime that we finish one of these books, I start to get really excited, both because I look ahead a little bit and start thinking about what is coming soon, but also because I'm always really curious to kind of hear what your overall impressions are. You are a very atypical Wheel of Time reader in a lot of ways, mostly because you're reading them, 30 years after they initially came out. And so I always find kind of your take on these to be really kind of interesting. And so I always look forward to the last episode of every kind of book. It's fun for me to see where you place things and think about them differently than I do. That being said, what do we have to do today? We're going to talk about a book for a while, and then I'm going to make Greg not remember a bunch of the names of the people in the book, and then we're going to call it a day. Any big things that you want to say about this book, or we can just kind of dive into what were your overall impressions of the Fires of Heaven? I know you were a little conflicted a couple of weeks ago. Where did you kind of land on it?
What a great segue that I'm going to ruin. Hey, I've had a question for a couple weeks, and I keep forgetting to ask it, so might as well ask it on air
Do it.
now instead of in our text messages. When we say that it's a 15-book series,
Yes,
right?
that is 14 books plus a prequel.
Plus a prequel, and the prequel is considered a full-ranked book, like it is one of the 15. Do we read it last? Is that where it gets placed? I feel like I've seen a box set where it's at the end.
Yeah, so I believe when we had initially started like 2.5 years ago, our plan was to read in publication order. So that would put New Spring between books 10 and 11. So we have a while yet until we get there. In the answer to your question, is it a numbered Wheel of Time book? I don't think the Wheel of Time books actually have numbers, even in the at least in the original printings, they don't. Maybe your edition does. Fascinating.
I have on the back of my mass market paperback, I see numbers, and it only goes up to 14.
If you list 1
entirely
through 14, New Spring is left off that list then. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And that was largely what inspired my question is I've had this new paperback hanging around, and so I've looked at the back a couple times. Like,
Yeah,
it's
totally.
only 14, but I knew it was something to do with a prologue novel. All right, so let's not cast a shadow across book 5, though, and give it its last minute of due. So it was, for me, I would say, one of the slower books so far. And as I think the audience has figured out, it did tick up for me kind of in the last couple weeks, probably like 4 weeks, thereabouts, from the Battle of Carrion,
Kyrian, but you're getting much closer.
Carrie Mulligan. I literally just watched Drive upstairs. That's why I went to Carrie Mulligan.
Also an incredible actress. Always go to Carrie Mulligan.
So I would say that last kind of chunk did raise my appreciation for this book a lot. I don't know that we've ever sat and ranked them, but I'd be willing to do so later because that'd be an interesting question. But at least at first,
I'm sorry, you don't know if we do this every book.
I don't. I have the memory of a goldfish.
That's amazing.
So I don't know if it ranks at the bottom. I guess we'll reveal that later in the show. But it's kind of an interesting question, I think, for me.
Yeah, I think as I was kind of contemplating this book and how I was going to talk about it today, the thing that really stood out to me on this reread, particularly with our format, I think kind of skewing how long or short the book feels, is I think this book really suffers from having fewer POV changes than a lot of the other books, right? This was my big problem with The Eye of the World when we originally were reading that, and I was like, I just struggle with being in Rand's head for 350 pages in a row. This book has a really odd structure in that there are kind of 3 major plot lines, but one of them, the Rand et al. And Kyrian and Camelin, probably gets a huge percentage of the book. Nynaeve and Elaine have things to do, but it always kind of feels like it's not pressing and urgent. And for the first third of the book, we get some Siwan and Min chapters, but that fades pretty quickly. For me, I think kind of what you're identifying is that we end up in a lot more like 7-8 chapters in a row with the same character's head, and that's hard for me, and it might be partially at least what's driving your kind of feeling of this being an especially slow book.
That feels right to me, and I want to reiterate what you said about that our format then makes 7 or 8 chapters a solid month, which is an unusual way to experience a book like this, one would assume. I don't know. I'm such a weirdo as a reader that nothing feels long to me ever because I read so quickly and you know. To my detriment. I mean, I think this podcast has demonstrated that people are always like, Greg, how do you read so many books a year? And I read them and I enjoy them, but I don't lodge them deep in my psyche. I kind of skim across and do enjoy them, but don't and so this podcast has revealed how bad my memory is. A week later, I don't remember where we were. So I do think that it's such an unusual structure for how I read that it in particular makes me feel, and I wouldn't even put it as frustrated, just kind of it makes the book feel like more of a slog than I think it has in some of the previous times,
I just want to point out, you are using the word slog about 3 books before most of the Wheel of Time community thought that was even a word that would possibly apply to the Wheel of Time. So
that's interesting. Well, and I will say, so again, we've never ranked before and never will tonight, but I would say I would play something like, I thought The Dragon Reborn and The Great Hunt kind of really had that driving propulsion towards the end. So whereas in this one we don't get that kind of big final battle structure, I think that to me feels like part of why it just felt a little more well, now I want to avoid the word slog. Felt a little more slower paced as we moved along.
I think I more or less agree with you. This is a book where the highs are really, really high and the lows take their time a bit. And I think that makes it kind of difficult to evaluate it against some of the other books in the series that maybe don't have quite the same wow factor at the end, but are really good all the way through for the most part. So
as we always do, even though you deny it, I would like for you to begin thinking about your relative rankings of these 5 books. What would you say is your least favorite? And I'm totally okay with fuzziness here. It's worth noting. I'm actually, today, for the first time, going to be discussing the tiers in my rankings, because that makes a lot of sense now. How are you feeling about these 5 books overall? And in particular, where do you think The Fires of Heaven fits in that ranking for you?
Well, and now I'm totally paranoid that I'm just like immediately contradicting whatever I said last time. But
you absolutely should.
So I would say kind of look in, and I'm literally looking at the back of the paperback with a list of the 5 titles, and it's like, what do I feel in this moment kind of as I remember these books? And I think I would say in my memory, Dragon Reborn is highest. But
okay.
As I recall, Rand is gone for most of that one.
Yeah,
right?
that is the book that is like all Perrin and Egwene and Matt.
Yeah, and I think part of what I'm feeling is Perrin's absence, right? And
yeah.
So I would probably go 3-4 because I like Perrin a lot, and I really liked his Seven Samurai plot in 4 quite a bit.
Yeah.
And he's been gone a while now, and that bums me out. After 3-4, I think that's when I would go 2-1-5. And I did just say I wasn't sure if this would be at the bottom, and I'm struggling a little bit with 1 and 5. And part of that is, you know, I always have this thing when I rank the Star Wars movies that I kind of have to put A New Hope pretty high because of it being groundbreaking and the time, like, we don't get the rest of it without that. And so I think I put The Eye of the World a notch ahead of The Fires of Heaven at the moment, but it's more in recognition of that than like I had such a great time reading that book, as I recall. So to catch up, just to see, that goes 3, 4, 2, 1, 5 from my favorite to least favorite. And it is kind of interesting that it is kind of pushing Rand a bit to the side, because I would say 2, 5, and 1 are probably the ones that have the most Rand, and I'm pushing him back. So I guess, you know, cut to me a month or who am I kidding? 6 months ago saying the complete opposite of that, but I feel good with 3, 4, 2, 1, 5.
I think the only real difference between that and your rankings last time is 2 has moved below 4, which is interesting and I think makes sense over time, right? Your opinions of those books are going to kind of settle in a bit, so it makes sense 4 would be one of the ones that would shift relatively quickly. I have very different rankings, but that's okay. I do want to note, we are now in the interesting place. We have read 5 Wheel of Time books, and they are each one in each of the 5 tiers of Wheel of Time books, as far as I am concerned, right? So my dead last 15th out of 15 book is The Eye of the World. That is in my I don't really care about reading these Wheel of Time book category, right? There are only 2 books in that tier. We've read one. We haven't read the other. My number 13 out of 15 books is The Great Hunt, so that's book 2. That I put in a tier with a couple of other books as like good Wheel of Time books that I just have like personal beef with for some reason. I think they are legitimately as good and as high quality as the rest, just not my favorite. At number 10 out of 15, I have The Dragon Reborn. That is one of 4 books in my average Wheel of Time book category. They are better than most fantasy books, but I don't think they live up to the highs of this series. My number 6 out of 15 book is The Fires of Heaven, which we just read. It is, to me, the worst of the really good Wheel of Time books, right? I think that the Battle of Caemlyn and the Battle of Cairhien are 2 kind of really awesome, exciting action sequences that really get me excited. All of the developments about Balefire and the Aes Sedai and Saladar are really interesting to me, but I agree with you, this is the slowest and least Perrin-y of all of the good Wheel of Time books, and so I put it at 6, which is below a number of other truly good Wheel of Time books. And we've talked about this before, The Shadow Rising is incredible. It is the number 1 Wheel of Time book. There are only 2 Wheel of Time books that belong in the top tier, and it is one of them. How do you... Oh, go ahead.
And I want to throw in, just apropos of nothing other than talking a bunch about Perrin, I shared with Tyler off air. I went and saw the movie September 5th, which has been nominated for, I think, just a screenplay Oscar. But it's a good movie. It's worth seeing, certainly. And there was a character the whole time, like, where do I know that guy from? Why do I know him? And it's not a major role, so it was like, he'd come on screen and then be gone for 15 minutes. I'm like, there's that guy again. Where do I know him? And it was Perrin from the Wheel of Time TV show, which, again, good for him. And to step up from prestige TV to prestige movie is a pretty good career step. But it was very funny to me that I could not figure it out for so long. And then, that beautiful satisfaction you get when you figured it out without looking at your phone. You're like, yes, I mastered it.
I did just see like a thing on the internet that they are calling raw dogging movies, where you just never Google it and you just have to have your own opinion about it forever. And I need to start doing this. You're right. The joy of finding something like that on your own is incredible. Before we dive into America's favorite game show, did you have any last thoughts on kind of the overall rankings of these books, their quality? Anything you're kind of thinking about as you've been working through that kind of tier list in the past 5 minutes that's come up and made you go like, oh, this kind of stands out to me about these books, or The Fires of Heaven in particular?
Well, one thing I want to cop to that I think is just baked into who I am is like just a little misogyny, right? That I find that I have not expressed enthusiasm about plots about the female characters. I think I've sometimes derided them as just the girls, which is not right, and yet has now is on the internet forever. And again, I try to be sensitive to my own biases in this way, but I do wonder if we had a female co-host who would maybe balance out some of that a little bit more, because you and I get frustrated by Nynaeve, and I want to know, like, is that somehow kind of our misogyny or just our preferences boiling through, or has she been a really frustrating character this book? Our one female listener we hear from regularly, we know is a few books behind, but she's gonna hear this in like mid-July and tell me all the ways that I've failed her and all other female Wheel of Time listeners. So I will look forward to that.
I will say my sample size is only 8, but I'm pretty sure, I was thinking through this while you were talking, I know a total of 8 women who have read The Wheel of Time, and 6 of them hate Nynaeve. So
all right, nice.
It's also misogyny, but it might be misogyny that is internalized by all of society. No, and I think that's very reasonable. Egwene is one of my absolute favorite characters in this series, but it's just really hard to give her all of the props when she has just been swimming in Rand's section of the book for so long. And you're right, Nynaeve and Elaine on their own just don't get me excited the way some of the other female characters do. So I'm very sorry for our female listeners. I will talk about the female characters once they actually have interesting things to do and say.
Well, and I think on that little explanation there, that sounds right to me. Egwene has been largely on the bench or only given the kind of Bechdel failing role of reacting to the man. But of not on your list is Suan, and I would say she was my favorite kind of potential character here. And when we do America's Favorite Game Show in a moment, I know I have to remember that the Queen of Andor, Morghese, whose name I definitely remember and didn't just pull out of thin air, right?
Correct. You are correct.
Okay. Those were two more compelling. Like, those are characters I'm interested to see their next steps. But again, in this book, they're both kind of knocked low. It's like I can't wait to see what happens with them. But what they actually did in this book is a little less compelling than we've seen other times.
Yeah, I think you're kind of nailing exactly this. You're saying in a better way what I said earlier, which is that this is Rand's book and everyone else is kind of in a holding pattern. And I think that's really not great for reading about anyone else. So I don't know. Game show. In The Fires of Heaven, there are 18 named POV characters. If you can get through the first 9, you are over 95% of the way into the total word count of this book. Just a reminder for those of you who haven't heard this in a long time and like Greg forgot that it existed, we play a game every book in which I have a ranked list of every POV character in the book, ranked in terms of how many words are from their perspective. We are looking for Greg to attempt to name all 18 in order. I think an A on this one is 13.
Oh, God. I will continue to play this game for now, but I will know that this podcast really makes it when you construct a Family Feud-style graphic that I can say the name and it'll flip, and I'll have my kids come down and yell, good answer, good answer.
I have the ability to do this in Excel. Don't tempt me.
All right. Number 1 has to be Rand.
By an extremely narrow margin. Other than...
Oh, narrow.
I think there are only 1 or 2 books where Rand is not the number 1 POV character, and this is the closest of anyone in which he is the number 1 POV character. He has 29.9% of the word count of this book.
Ooh. Hot on his heels has to be Nynaeve.
That is correct. 29.6% of the word count in this book. Between the two of them, we are already at about 60%.
Well, and so following that, my guess is that we're not at the Suan Min plotline, because the plotline is so much smaller and they split the POV at least a little bit. So I'm struck more by who were other characters along with those characters for it. So I'm going to guess Elaine next.
Elaine is actually number 4, not number 3, but within 1% of number 3. That's high quality as a guess. She is at 6.4% of the book.
So then the other one I was going to guess is Moraine?
Moraine is way down the list. She is on it, but only has 2 POVs, and one of them is really, really short.
Then it's got to be Matt.
Matt is number 5, actually. Tied with Elaine at 6.4%.
All right. Rand, Nynaeve, missed one.
Yeah.
Elaine, Matt.
Correct.
So it's got to be Suan.
Suan is actually number 7 at 2.9% of the book. If you're going to list the main characters in this series, you got to start with the Emmonsfield 5, and you're missing one.
Egwene.
Yes, Egwene comes in at 7.5% of the book. She gets a lot of those dream scenes are from her perspective and kind of the time before and after it. I was honestly surprised by how high she was as well. I think it's mostly in the first half of the book that she gets most of her spotlight. So, just a reminder, 1 Rand, 2 Nynaeve, 3 Egwene, 4 Elaine, 5 Matt, 6 you have not gotten, 7 Siwan.
Min has to be around Suan because she
Min
got
is
a bunch
correct.
Of those.
Yeah, she actually, it surprised me. She has almost 60% more word count than Suan does, and I'm with you. I think if I was playing this game, I would have guessed Suan far before I had guessed Min. I think Suan has the more interesting plot in this book, but it's mostly told from Min's POV.
All right. Now we're getting into the wilds.
Now it's getting tough.
Give me the I have through number 7, so we're on to number 8.
Yes.
Just give me the percentage, but not the name, obviously.
2.5%.
2.5% of the book. All right.
And it's worth noting 8 and 9 are both almost exactly 2.5%, so I will accept them in either order.
Okay, so thinking about and you know, I'm not so good at remembering POV as we're demonstrating actively. So I'm thinking about like characters that get a big chunk of the spotlight, right? Who are present. Avienda comes to mind, though I don't remember much of her POV.
I don't think Avienda gets a POV in the first 10 books of this series. It is very rare.
Okay. So thinking who else takes some of this. I know we got to be approaching a Galad at some point.
Galad did not get any POV in this book.
No, he just pops in on
he is in other people's perspectives.
All right, then I'm just going to shout out people I know had some. So Morghese had some.
Morghese is number 9 and comes in at 2.4%. She had quite a bit of the prologue, is why it feels like she has an outside spot on this list.
We also, I know there was some, but not a ton of Asmodean. I mean, the very end of the book, right?
Asmodean is number 17. He only has 0.1% of the POV, but he will count towards you need 13 names in order to get an A.
And then we need the old guy who was chasing Nynaeve and Elaine, which is
Gareth Brine.
Right.
You are absolutely correct. Is at number 8, 2.5% of the book. Once again, he had a significant portion of the prologue, and thus is actually slightly higher than Morgaze on the list.
All right, so
we are now at the
Morgaze
point.
was 9.
Yes,
and it's number 10.
Yes, it is worth noting. We now need to get 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Somehow you got 16 and 17, and then 18. Numbers do not matter at this point. Everyone here is below 1.5% of the book. If you give me a name, it counts.
All right, Robin at some point got a tiny little bit.
He has 1% of the word count in this book. He is number 13 on the list.
And then the Mogadien got a little.
Mogadien is the number 18. She has 0.07% of this book.
All right, and I'm trying to now just think of who is in plots that we haven't seen. Moraine we already have on the list.
Yeah, she was at number 16, just above Asmodean.
Lan, I don't believe, got any POV
None
this time around. You established that Avienda didn't, and
Correct.
I don't believe the Wise Ones did. So I kind of feel like we've checked off that whole plot line.
More or less.
There's
one weird name in there, but yes.
Okay. Then I'm thinking of the Nynaeve Elaine. We obviously have Tom in that group, but I don't recall Tom getting POV.
No male POVs in that group.
Even
Actually,
the circus guy? The circus
there's
guy.
only one more. He does not get any. No.
He didn't get any. Oh,
No.
okay.
No Valen Luca. As much as I love me some Valen Luca, and it's worth noting my favorite internet theory in the history of internet theories is that Valen Luca was actually the Dragon Reborn. We'll talk about that in like 5 books. But no, there's only one more male name, and it's one that I forgot was in this book. The rest of them are women.
So I think I'm out of names, so I will take my B. But I want us to say that one of the commanders from Tyr, that group of people who watched Matt be kick-ass, is somewhere in there.
No.
And I feel like there's another Forsaken in there somewhere that I'm not remembering. Lanfear?
Almost.
We didn't get Lanfear.
All right. So the names that we have left, Leandrin of the Black Aja gets 1.4% of the book when she gets punished by Mogadien. Elida gets some time in the prologue when she's talking to the Aes Sedai about Rand. Hadnan Kader was the kind of in Rand's plot line. He's the wagon driver who was constantly talking to Moraine. Right. And at the end of the book, he tells Lanfear that's where she gets the information to attack Rand. There was also the Lady Altiema, who showed up at the very beginning of the book and talked to Morgaze. She's from Tyr. We kind of vaguely remember her. And the one that I literally didn't remember was in this book, which was also my almost a Forsaken. Padden Fane apparently got some POV in the plot, in the prologue, or sometime very early on. But 18 POV characters, I think you actually did scrape by with an A-. You guessed Moraine way too early, but I think you got to 13. This game will get much harder in the next couple of books. I'm so sorry, Greg. Normally, I then follow up with what do you have to say about it, but I don't think you have much to say about the game.
I mean, I think it's... I was getting ready, washing dishes after dinner and telling my wife that I was about to come to the basement and play a game I'm very bad at. And one of the things I was saying to her, which is worth repeating, obviously, to the people who actually care about the podcast, is just that, it's striking to me how hard this game is and what it says about the way I consume this book. And I think it means that, while the POV often shapes the content, I'm still mostly reading for the content. Yeah. And the closest analogy I have is or analogous situation is Game of Thrones, right? Which is very much POV. But I always felt like whose shoes we were jumping into mattered so much to me in that book. And what comes to mind first is that they're totally on different parts of the continent. But it's that's what we got here, and yet it doesn't seem to matter quite as much. And maybe it's that the characters are more clumped here, so that in a Game of Thrones book, it's well, if I'm going from Arya to Sansa to, I don't know, somebody else who's in that book, I already forgot. I'm
probably going to lose us at least a couple of listeners here, and I'm so sorry. I think it's just because Robert Jordan is a better writer than George R.R. Martin, right? I think George R.R. Martin is really good about saying we are in Arya's head, so let's tell an Arya story. And George R.R. Martin is much smarter about, like, I have an Elaine story to tell. Who is the most interesting person to put that POV from, even if the answer isn't Elaine? And I think that's what's happening so much, is that in the in the George R.R. Martin books, you end up with a lot of times, like, there are 8 people in an area all at once. They're clumped in the same way of Wheel of Time, but it will all come from, like, Jon Snow's perspective instead of 6 different people in that area. The Wheel of Time is much more willing to say, I have 6 people in a clump, and I'm going to give all 6 of them a POV. That's actually kind of why I like this series a little bit more than the Game of Thrones in some cases. Like, it's less deep into any one character, but I think that's why we get a more nuanced understanding of every character.
That sounds right to me. I'll take it. Sorry, George R.R. Martin fans. I did just see him on the internet today asking Stephen King how he writes so many damn books, which made me laugh a lot because I don't think we're getting another Game of Thrones book.
Ever. We are never getting another Game of Thrones book.
And
I've lived through
Patrick Rothfuss as well.
I haven't read the second Patrick Rothfuss book. I read the first one and I was like, I ain't doing another series that the author is going to die before it's finished. I'm good. What we now have for our usual plan for this end of book kind of episode is a tradition that is going to take longer and longer every time we do it. That's right. It's time to go over all of the unfulfilled prophecies from every previous book and see if there is anything that kind of sparks now that we've got the new material. I will actually say I've had a very interesting time going through these prophecies recently because, as Greg knows, I have just introduced a prophecy into my Dungeons and Dragons game, so I have been paying very careful attention to, like, how early and how do you set things up. It's made going through all of these prophecies very fun. What I would like to do is kind of our normal structure. We're going to go book by book and prophecy by prophecy. I'll list a few of them, and I want you to tell me if you have any thoughts about what they might mean in the context, or if you think any of them have occurred in this book and we should scratch them off the list going forward. Starting with the Eye of the World, Min had a number of visions. She saw Tom with a man juggling fire. She saw Perrin with a broken crown, and Perrin among a field of trees flowering. Nothing too special here, I don't think. Anything exciting or interesting in those?
Was there a man juggling fire in the circus?
I don't know that there was, now that I think about it, but that's an interesting question.
The only one I would say would be checked off in that, but it seems like we would have a memorable scene of that, of something happening.
Yeah, that's fair.
Within that. And again, since Perrin sat out, the idea of a flowering field, kind of feels like the life he's bringing back to the two rivers and that region, but I would say neither completely fulfilled yet.
Totally. Okay, then we jump into Matt, who she had a vision of the red eagle, a vision of an eye on a scale, and a vision of a laughing face that she interpreted to mean that he has the Dark One's luck. I think that last one is pretty solidly confirmed at this point, and the red eagle is starting to make sense. Any thoughts on these overall?
Just refresh my memory that some have started to fly a flag for him that with the red eagle.
For Matt, they are primarily flying a flag with a red hand as opposed to a red eagle. So far, we've seen the red eagle and the red wolf associated with Perrin because he's currently in Manetheren.
Okay.
We then get to Rand, who had quite a few of these. There was a crown of laurels, there was a beggar's staff, a bloody handprint, hot irons, 3 women standing over his funeral pyre, and a black rock that is wet with his blood. Anything interesting here?
Moving forward with the 3 women, there was obviously a lot more discussion about who those women are and what their relationship would be with each other and with Rand. Seems like we got advanced, but don't know the end of that story yet.
I agree with that. I do think it is interesting, though, to say Min has had a vision that says that she and Elaine and someone else will fall in love with Rand, but she didn't know how that would turn out. If those 3 women are the same 3 women as in this vision, that would suggest we at least know that they will continue to be dedicated to him until his death, it seems. That is what we've got for book 1. Although there is one more that we will come back to in just a moment. In book 2, Min had several viewings. 1, that Elaine would be queen. 2, Egwene with the white flame of Tar-Valon. And Galad, who will not notice who he hurts. We've always kind of had suspicions that Elaine and Egwene's kind of made sense for their futures. Galad, I feel like maybe not fulfilled, but at least we've seen a pretty solid example of how he does not care who he hurts in this book.
Yeah, I think, more and more we're just seeing, him moving under his own motivation without that kind of care about whatever's happening.
There was one more Min viewing in this book that I want to note because I think we are now at the point where Robert Jordan had kind of somewhat revealed what was going on here. So Elaine has a vision in this book, or Min has a vision of Elaine holding a hot iron and an axe. And this actually ties into a vision that we had about Rand in the previous book, where he also had a vision associated with hot irons. This is actually something that now we are at the point I can jump in and give you information that would have been on the internet around this time. In Robert Jordan's original notes for this series, there was a plan long term for Rand to do something that upset Elaine sufficiently that she blinded him with hot irons. Robert Jordan abandoned that plan relatively quickly. I believe by book 5 or 6, he had already kind of said, like, those visions are going to turn out kind of fuzzy, not directly like I had originally planned them to. I feel like this is one of my roles as a person on this podcast, is to say, don't get overly concerned with the hot irons. They're not really the thing that they were originally set out to target. Any thoughts about that new information before we talk about the other prophecies?
I quit the podcast. I was here only for the hot iron content. So great. I'm out.
Absolutely valid. We also got one line from the Cariathan cycle in that book that has not come true yet. It is twice dawns the day when his blood is shed, once for mourning, once for birth. And so we should definitely be looking out for a day with 2 dawns at some point in the future, but I don't think that has happened.
Cool.
Book 3. Min, around Perrin, sees a vision of a Tuatha with a sword and a falcon and a hawk. Obviously, Perrin wasn't in this book, no new things, but it's worth noting, keep an eye out for the Tuatha with a sword and for a hawk. We then get into some of Egwene's dreams from the 3rd book, and there are a few interesting ones here that we might want to think about. So we have Rand confronting the Seanchan, a hawk fastening a collar on Perrin's neck, Perrin with a beard leading a pack of wolves, Mat interacting with a number of Seanchan, and Mat putting an eye on a scale.
Well, that's the second mention of an eye on a scale for Mat, which is striking, but I would still say unfulfilled here.
It is worth noting it is the second instance from 2 different places. One was a Min vision and one was an Egwene dream.
But I'm correct in thinking we haven't seen him get an eye injury or
No.
debate anything like that or so on. So that seems largely unfulfilled. And then the Perrin kind of mostly setting aside. I mean, Beard leading wolves seems kind of fulfilled already, but could be an ongoing situation, right? Within that.
Then we switch into book 4. Min had a couple of viewings. She saw Galad at Egwene's feet, either bowing to him or breaking her neck, and she knew that what happened on that day would determine which it would be. And she also saw about Logain, a halo of glory to come. Galad we get some time with, but we don't see his interactions with Egwene. I think that's Gawain, not Galad. I need to double check this, but I think that was actually a viewing of Gawain, and I wrote it down wrong. The Logain vision, on the other hand, I think we now have some really interesting places we can think about this since we've seen Logain as a character. What are your take on either of those viewings?
Well, on the Logain one, I immediately think about the fact that Rand is now saying that we don't have to stop men from channeling. And so this seems like a pathway forward for Logain to regain his glory. We've talked about how we don't currently have a way for somebody to get unstilled, but it feels like one might be percolating a little bit in some regard, right? If that's a form of healing or not. And then I feel like if Egwene is destined to lead the White Tower, then whichever of the boys, who can tell those 2 boys apart anyway, is there, it feels like a moment where that will be the guards of the White Tower either agreeing to serve Egwene or preventing her from ruling. Feels like what that means to me.
We get some dreams from Egwene. She sees Rand in chains. She sees Rand building a wall to keep Min and many others out. She sees Matt wrestling with a Shan woman who is tied to him. And she also, I think this wasn't a dream, but something that was discussed in a dream, was the prophecy that the Kara Karn, that is Rand, is the only way the Aiel will survive the last battle, but he will only save a remnant of them. Any thoughts on her dreams in that book?
Particularly interesting to me that so much of this was the end of this book involved Matt overcoming an Aiel woman who had been chained to him in a certain way and, was then trying to kill him. So it feels to me like, did Robert Jordan write down the wrong, culture, or is this just a pattern that's going to repeat in the future? A lot of what you mentioned in the chunk before that was about the Shan-Chan. And again, other than a couple characters, the Shan-Chan largely sat out this book. So it all feels safer to say yet to come.
Absolutely. Perrin had a couple of dreams in book 4. He saw Egwene in a crowd of women, all of them kneeling to her, including Elaine and Nynaeve, and he saw Rand dressed in rags with a bandage covering his eyes. At least part of that is likely related to the debunked theory that we talked about earlier. Any thoughts on Egwene with many women bowing to her?
Again, makes me think of if she's headed to become the Amerlin seat, what that would mean and what that would look like on the way to do so. It feels like the safest way to defeat the current bad regime at the White Tower is through the people in Salidara. So how do we connect all of them up together, right?
It's Salidar. Yeah. I'm just going to say that every time now.
Nope. But yeah, how do we get Egwene to kind of ride the tide of that Aes Sedai rebellion to get us there?
Interesting. Yeah. We are then on to book 5, the current book. We had some prophecies in it. And one thing that I found really interesting is how many of these, when we read them, I'm not sure I knew what they were about. And then now that we have finished the book, I feel like I have a lot more insight than I did even when we read them for the first time. So I want to start with some of Egwene's dreams. She saw Rand sitting in a chair, but the owner of that chair would be murderously angry that it was taken from her. Specifically her. Perrin kissing Fael with 2 banners, an eagle and a wolf, and a tinker with a sword, and every time the tinker moved, there was a chill of doom through everything. Matt throwing dice with blood streaming down his face, and Tom putting his hand into a fire and drawing out the blue stone that normally rests on Moraine's head.
So the chair feels like Morghase's chair, right? And
right.
Like the throne of Andor, and that feels like she would be super pissed about what has happened there and how it's now going to be potentially difficult to take it back, although we know Rand was ready to hand it over to Elaine kind of on the assumption that Morghase was dead. So would he object to handing it back over? I think it's an open question. Yep. Perrin largely sitting out, but as you repeat this and the earlier chunk, it's a good reminder that the Tinkerer with a sword is going to be, a key part of how that plot line develops. Yeah. Matt is causing a lot of bloodshed, and he, has the luck of the Dark One. So it feels like, if that's just that blood is following that luck is one thing, but it could also be that he is going to pay a terrible cost, which we haven't seen.
It's worth noting the blood is streaming down his face, so this could also be tied to the multiple Matt and eyes things that we have seen in previous prophecies.
Okay.
And then I definitely need to get your thoughts on Tom pulling Moraine's jewel out of the fire.
I mean, that, I wonder, it portends this kind of hypothesized return of Moiraine if Tom does have a way to get to Moiraine wherever she is. Again, I'm leaning towards Moiraine and Lanfear ended up on another plane, like the what's our logo? The portal stones.
Oh, yeah.
Lead to, and so does Tom have a way to reach into the fire and pull Moraine back in some way? That seems like a potential opening for that kind of return, such as Gandalf the White.
Interesting, yeah. Rand quotes a line of the prophecies of the dragon that I think are really interesting and feel like foreshadowing, even though we didn't get too much about them. The lines are, "Into the heart he thrusts his sword, into the heart to hold their hearts. Who draws it out shall follow after. What hand can grip that fearful blade?" And Rand specifically quotes this regarding Kalendor, which in the previous book he drove into the heart of the stone. So this suggests that Rand was following the prophecy when he left the sword in the stone, which is a fun way of phrasing it. But it's also worth noting this prophecy suggests that someone other than him will follow after him and draw that sword. And so we should really be wondering, like, who would either take it without Rand's permission or who would Rand trust to take the sword.
Yeah, and what comes to mind is we have a previously false dragon who's going to be crowned in glory, right? And what if Logain becomes Rand's chief lieutenant or some such? That is what comes to mind at the moment, anyway.
Interesting. We finally have Min's visions in this book, all of them when she is in Saladar. About Sheriam, she sees rays of silver and blue flashing all about her head. About Edicina, she sees an Adam around her neck, and then the Adam is shattered. About Gareth Bryan, she sees a vision of his sigil tearing off a crown of roses, and then she sees a vision that suggests that if Gareth Bryan and Siwan Sancha stay close to one another, they will both live, but if they are apart for too long, both will die. And then looking at Merrigan, Arena, and Nicola, the girls who came to town with Nynaeve and Elaine, she says that all of them, or at least one of them, is going to be trouble for Elaine.
Only to reiterate what I believe we said last week, which is that we now know that Moghedien is in Saladar. So
I'm so proud of you for getting both of those names right.
So that must be one of those three girls, or that seems likely that it's one of those three women, especially since it was difficult for Nynaeve specifically.
Absolutely. And I think as we were talking before about kind of the Seanchan and how absent they have felt from a number of books, it's worth noting this vision of Edicina makes it very clear that not only will the Seanchan be back at some point, but they will be back and collaring Aes Sedai, which is quite worrisome in a number of ways. That is all of the unresolved prophecies that we have read thus far in this series. Hearing that kind of litany of visions and ideas and moments, is there any kind of last thoughts you have about where you expect these prophecies to push us? Or honestly, the last thing on my kind of notes for today is, what were your overall kind of thoughts about where you see the series going forward? We've kind of done the retrospective, but what are you expecting in Lord of Chaos and after?
I mean, what comes to mind immediately is who is the Lord of Chaos. And, on one of my other shows, I have to play this game a lot with the titles of the Mandalorian television show episodes, which are always the blank. And the better uses of that title are always where you're like, it could be one of many of these people that are the blank. So I know there's no the on this book, but who is going to be Lord of Chaos? And there's an obvious candidate in Rand, but feels like we could have some very different answers as a part of this. I was just thinking, as you were mentioning the Seanchan, that I still in my head kind of think of that as the problem we take care of on the way to prepare everybody for the last battle. So I am predicting, I'm kind of thinking about this in terms of the continent. I'm predicting some trouble on the far western side because the Seanchan have to start building up. If they're not the main villains next book, I think we have to start building them up so they are a big problem the book after. Yeah. I am predicting some Perrin drama that was hinted at by now I'm getting all confused, by
Elaine's dreams?
No, by Fael's father?
Yes, father. Her father. Well,
her father.
Perrin's father-in-law, her father.
Right. At the end of that book. So I'm kind of expecting some time in that part of the continent. And then I almost am feeling like we need to cool off Rand for a little while. Like, we'll just kind of let the kind of eastern portion of the continent kind of just be ticking away without us giving it its full attention. So I assume, having said that out loud now, that that's exactly wrong, and we'll get just as much Rand next book. But it feels to me like the other parts of the continent that we didn't touch on, that's actually probably the George R.R. Martin influence on me. I believe it's book 4 to book 5.
Yeah.
It was like he split it north-south, and it does feel like we've been neglecting so many pieces that those pieces, if they're going to continue to be part of this story, need to get some attention next book.
Well, and I think this is the fun thing about the Wheel of Time is anytime you look forward, you're like, okay, there are 87 more things that I think Robert Jordan needs to resolve, and at most he can fit 15 of them in the next book. And so I always kind of feel unsure what is coming next, and I think that's a great place to be when you're a third of the way through a series. We shouldn't know what the ending looks like yet, and so I'm kind of excited to see how much we're building new versus how much we're resolving old going forward. Any last thoughts on this or future books before we remind everyone how just massively enormous the reading is for next week? Start now if you haven't.
Well, I will just take the opportunity to express the sentiments that I know we both shared, that we continue to love going on this journey together. I think we continue to be amazed that literally anybody is listening to us. And
Correct.
We thank you all for that attention and time, because it is a big commitment. And, you know, we continue to feel like as the world crumbles around us, we need this more than ever. And it's great to kind of get that escape and to continue on this journey on our way through. So as Tyler just alluded to, we hope you like spending time in the books, because the prologue for next week, which is our one focus, will be we're diving right back in next week. We're not taking a break as we have between other books. So you should read the prologue of Lord of Chaos, which is larger almost by a factor of 2 than any reading we've done before this. So I believe I checked in my mass market paperback. I think it's 73 pages, I think is right.
Yeah, I was going to say it was high 60s in my trade paperback, so that makes sense.
Yeah, it's 74. I flipped to it. So we really debated this, whether we should split it up. There's some POV breaks and we could group them. But it just felt like, in terms of our podcast, that the atom is one chapter, that you can't get any smaller than that. So we're going to take the whole of the prologue. So like Tyler said, start reading now. Give yourself more than you usually do. Tyler, am I right in thinking this will be kind of a one-off, at least for a little while, to have something this gargantuan?
Yeah, I think that the prologues of this book in the next few might potentially make us think like maybe prologues is the first, week of a book we're willing to go a bit longer. But from then until one chapter that we will definitely need to break into 4 or 5 pieces, I think you are correct. This is going to be very, very rare that we have a reading this long.
And we hope you will do that long homework. Man, I always get to just give out homework. So, and Tyler, I know this is dropping kind of at the end of award season, so I'm going to definitely say confidently that I've just recorded a whole bunch of really cool podcasts about the Oscars and the Oscar award-winning movies. So if you have interest in that, I co-host a show called The Long Take Review, which you can find wherever podcasts are, and hopefully you are somebody who might be interested in movies and hearing about that. The beauty of that show, like this show where you can go back to the archives at any time, the beauty of that show is if you watch a movie from this year or last year and you just like, I got to hear what somebody else thought about that, you can look through our back catalog. They're all available and find like, oh, good, they did talk about the substance because I need to know what I just experienced. Or, oh my God, what was The Brutalist and why was it that long? We'll get you there. So check out that show. Again, that's called The Long Take Review, and it's available wherever podcasts are. And after you check out that, because you need more Greg in your life, you should join us again next time as we travel further and further and further and further through the glass columns.
You're one further short if it's one per book.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tyler Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.